My own mother looked the judge straight in the eye and said I was mentally incompetent, said I'd been unstable my whole life, said I should never control my own finances, let alone inherit anything from my grandmother. I sat there wearing my grandmother's pearl earrings and said absolutely nothing. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I'm Nancy Bergman, and I'm 33 years old, and the day my mother tried to steal my inheritance by declaring me mentally incompetent in front of a judge, I was sitting in the Milwaukee County Courthouse on March 14th wearing my grandmother's pearl earrings and a navy blazer I'd bought specifically for this moment. The courtroom was smaller than the ones I usually testified in, room 412 on the 4th floor, reserved for probate matters and guardianship hearings, the kind of cases that don't draw crowds, that don't make headlines, that happen quietly while families destroy each other over money and call it love. And my mother, Daisy Hollister, sat at the petitioner's table in a navy blazer that matched mine, though she'd posted about choosing hers on Instagram 3 days earlier, like this was a fashion show instead of a legal battle. And she wore pearl earrings too. My grandmother's pearl earrings, actually. The ones she must have stolen during one of her concerned visits when she was systematically draining my grandmother's bank account. And somehow that detail, that petty theft of jewelry, made me angrier than everything else combined, made me understand that this wasn't just about money. This was about erasing my grandmother completely, about taking everything she'd built, everything she'd saved, everything she'd left to the granddaughter who'd actually loved her, who'd actually shown up, who'd actually been there when it mattered. The judge, Patricia Kowalski, a woman in her mid-60s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, sat behind the bench looking at the case file in front of her with an expression I'd seen before, seen 38 times before actually, because here's what my mother didn't know, here's what her lawyer didn't know, here's what nobody sitting at that petitioner's table had bothered to research. I'm not just Nancy Bergman, accountant from Milwaukee, I'm Nancy Bergman, certified fraud examiner who specializes in elder financial abuse, who investigates cases where people steal from vulnerable seniors, who testifies as expert witnesses in courts across Wisconsin, who has appeared in Judge Kowalski's courtroom 11 times, who Judge Kowalski once called on the record one of the most credible expert witnesses she'd encountered in 20 years on the bench. And my mother, sitting there in her stolen pearls, had absolutely no idea who she was actually fighting, had no idea that the quiet daughter she'd abandoned 19 years ago had spent those years becoming exactly the kind of person who could destroy schemes like the one she was running, had spent 7 years learning how to read bank statements, how to spot forged documents, how to build cases that sent people to federal prison, and she was about to find out. My mother's lawyer, Bradley Fenwick, was young, maybe 28, wearing a suit that was too big for him, like he was playing dress-up in his father's closet, and he stood to give his opening statement with the kind of confidence that comes from not knowing how badly you've already lost, how completely you've been outplayed, how thoroughly your client has lied to you about who the opposition actually is. And he started talking, started painting this picture of a concerned mother who'd been estranged from her daughter due to family conflict, but who'd never stopped caring, never stopped worrying, never stopped being a mother. And I watched my actual mother nod along, performing concern, performing maternal love, performing the role of someone who gave a damn about anyone other than herself. And I wanted to laugh, wanted to interrupt, wanted to stand up and ask Bradley if he'd bothered to Google me, if he'd done even the most basic research, if he'd thought to wonder why an accountant from Milwaukee would be so calm, so still, so completely unbothered by his accusations of mental incompetence. But I stayed silent, stayed frozen, because that was the plan, that was the trap. Let them commit, let them lie, let them build their case on a foundation of assumptions that were about to crumble. Bradley kept talking, describing my grandmother Dorothy as a vulnerable elderly woman who'd been isolated from her family, who'd been manipulated, who'd been convinced to leave everything to a granddaughter, who'd systematically cut off contact with her daughter, with her real family, with the people who actually cared. And the irony was suffocating, was crushing, was so thick I could barely breathe, because the truth, the actual truth, was that my mother had abandoned me when I was 14, had remarried within 3 months of my parents' divorce, had decided her new life with Theodore Hollister and his laundromats had no room for her old daughter, had sent exactly one Christmas card in 19 years, one card, And then nothing, no birthdays, no graduations, no phone calls, no interest, no love. Nothing except silence and my grandmother Dorothy, who'd raised me, who'd taught me to track every penny, who'd show me how to read bank statements and balance checkbooks. And understand that paper trails don't lie. She was the one who'd been isolated, who'd been manipulated, who'd been victimized, except not by me, by them, by my mother and her husband who'd spent the last year of her life draining her accounts, taking her money, forging documents, stealing from a woman who'd taught third graders to read for 36 years and had saved every penny of her $42,000 annual salary to leave something behind for the granddaughter who'd actually stayed, who'd actually cared, who'd actually been there when she was dying. Have you ever sat in a room while someone lied about you so thoroughly, so completely, that you barely recognized yourself in their description? Have you ever listened to someone rewrite your entire history, turn your love into manipulation, turn their absence into your fault, turn their theft into your crime? Type betrayal if you've been there, type stolen if you know what I'm talking about. Because I need you to understand what was happening in that courtroom. I need you to see that this wasn't just about money. This was about my mother trying to gaslight an entire legal system, trying to convince a judge that the daughter she'd abandoned was actually the villain, that the granddaughter who'd held Dorothy's hand while she died was actually the abuser. And the worst part, the absolutely crushing part, was that she almost believed it herself. I could see it in her face, in the way she nodded along to Bradley's speech, in the way she arranged her features into concern and worry and maternal distress. She told this story so many times, had convinced herself so thoroughly that she'd forgotten it was a lie, had forgotten that I was the one who'd spent every Sunday morning with Dorothy drinking coffee and balancing her checkbook, had forgotten that she was the one who disappeared, who'd chosen a new husband over her own child, who'd shown up only when there was money to take. Bradley presented his evidence, such as it was my therapy records from when I was 14, 8 months of seeing a school counselor after my mother decided I wasn't worth keeping, 8 months of talking about feelings of abandonment and low self-worth, which apparently, according to Bradley's creative interpretation, meant I was mentally ill, had been mentally ill my whole life, was currently mentally ill and therefore incompetent to manage finances. And I watched him hold up these records. These private, painful records from when I was a child processing the trauma of being rejected by my own mother, and I watched him use my pain as evidence, use my suffering as proof, use my therapy as a weapon, and I felt something cold and clear settle over me. Not anger exactly, not rage, just absolute certainty that I was going to destroy him, destroy them, destroy this case, so completely that Bradley Fenwick would remember this day, every time he considered taking a case without doing basic research, every time he trusted a client without verifying their story, every time he walked into a courtroom thinking he'd already won. He also presented a statement from my stepsister, Merlin Hollister, Theodore's daughter from his first marriage, a statement claiming I'd always seemed unstable, erratic, concerning, a statement signed by a woman who was 9 years old the last time she saw me, who hadn't spoken to me in 19 years, who knew absolutely nothing about my life, my work, my competence, my anything, but whose signature on a legal document was apparently enough to question my mental capacity, to suggest I needed a conservator, to argue that the woman sitting at the petitioner's table, the woman who'd abandoned me, should be appointed to manage my money, my inheritance, my grandmother's legacy. And I looked at my mother, really looked at her for the first time in almost 2 decades. And I saw nothing, no recognition, no guilt, no awareness that what she was doing was monstrous, just calculation, just strategy, just a woman who decided that stealing from her dead mother was acceptable, that destroying her living daughter was necessary, that money was worth more than any relationship, any truth, any shred of human decency. And I understood then, understood with perfect clarity, that there was no reaching her, no redeeming her, no possibility of reconciliation or healing or family reunion. There was just this courtroom, this moment, this choice between letting her take everything or fighting back with everything I had. And I'd already made my choice, had made it the moment I read her petition, had made it when I found my grandmother's journal, had made it when I understood that Dorothy had known, had documented, had left me the weapons I needed to win. When Bradley finished his opening statement, Judge Kowalski asked if the petitioner wished to make a personal statement, if my mother wanted to address the court directly, and Daisy stood, smoothed her stolen blazer, arranged her face into an expression of pained concern, and started talking, started with a reasonable version, the I'm just a worried mother version, the I only want what's best for everyone version. But something happened as she spoke. Something shifted. The mask slipped. The performance cracked, and her voice rose, got sharper, got harder, got meaner, and she pointed at me, actually pointed her finger across the courtroom like I was an exhibit, like I was evidence, like I was a thing rather than a person, and she said I was mentally sick, said it loud enough that the court reporter's fingers stuttered on the keys, said I was incompetent, unstable, that I'd always been this way, always been difficult, always been broken, said I should never be allowed to control anyone's finances, let alone inherit from the woman I'd supposedly manipulated, and the word supposedly, the way she said it with that little twist of sarcasm, that tiny implication that my love for my grandmother was fake, was performance, was manipulation, that word made my hands curl into fists under the table, made my jaw clench so hard my teeth ached, made me want to stand up and scream that she was the one who'd manipulated, who'd stolen, who'd forged documents and drained accounts and preyed on an elderly woman who'd been too ashamed to tell anyone what was happening, too proud to admit her own daughter was robbing her, too confused to fight back. But I didn't stand, didn't scream, didn't react, just sat there with my grandmother's pearls in my ears and my evidence in my briefcase and my trap fully set, waiting for the moment when everything my mother thought she knew about me, about this case, about how this would end, would shatter like glass, would break like bones, would destroy her the way she'd tried to destroy me. Judge Kowalski watched my mother's outburst, without changing expression, without reacting, just observed with the kind of professional detachment that comes from seeing too many families destroy each other in courtrooms, from hearing too many lies dressed up as concern, from watching too many people perform love while committing cruelty, and when my mother finally finished, finally sat down breathing hard like she'd just run a marathon, like pointing at me and calling me sick had required physical exertion, Judge Kowalski turned to Bradley Fenwick, turned to this young lawyer who still looked confident, who still thought he was winning, who still had no idea what was about to happen, and she asked him a simple question, asked it in a tone that was pleasant, curious, almost friendly. She asked, "Counselor, do you truly have no idea who this woman is, the woman your client just called mentally incompetent?" And Bradley blinked, looked confused, looked at his notes like the answer might be written there, looked at me like he was seeing me for the first time and trying to figure out what he'd missed, what detail he'd overlooked, what piece of information could possibly be relevant that he hadn't already covered, and he said, his voice less confident now, uncertain, "She's an accountant, Your Honor. She works for a firm in Milwaukee, and the Judge Patricia Kowalski, who I'd testified in front of 11 times, who I'd helped convict 31 financial predators, who'd watched me cross-examine money launderers and embezzlers and fraudsters for 7 years." She looked at Bradley with an expression that wasn't quite pity, wasn't quite amusement, was something closer to professional disappointment, the look you give someone who's made a mistake so fundamental, so obvious, so completely avoidable that you almost can't believe they're standing in your courtroom. And she said, "Just an accountant. Mr. Fenwick, just an accountant," and the way she said it, the emphasis on the word just, made my mother's confident expression falter, made Theodore shift in his seat, made Bradley's face start to pale, because they were beginning to understand, beginning to realize, beginning to comprehend that they'd walked into something they couldn't walk out of, that they'd built their case on assumptions that were catastrophically wrong, that they'd brought a knife to a gunfight, brought lies to a court that valued evidence, brought amateur hour to a professional venue, and they were about to learn exactly what that meant. Exactly what happened when you tried to steal from someone who'd spent 7 years learning how to catch people exactly like you. Exactly what price you paid for underestimating the quiet daughter you'd thrown away like garbage 19 years ago. My attorney, Caroline Jankowski, stood then, calm, composed, a former prosecutor who'd switched to civil litigation after burning out on criminal cases, 52 years old with sharp eyes and zero tolerance for bullshit, and she said, her voice clear and professional, "Your Honor, we'd like to present evidence that will reframe the court's understanding of this case. Will provide context that the petitioner's counsel appears to have missed. Will demonstrate not only that my client is competent, is qualified, is exactly the kind of person who should be managing these assets, but also that the real financial abuse in this case came from a very different direction than Mr. Fenwick has suggested, and she opened her briefcase, pulled out a folder that was thick, that was organized, that contained copies of everything, bank statements, journal entries, forged documents, patterns of theft, evidence of crimes that had been committed not against my grandmother's will, but against my grandmother herself, by the woman sitting at the petitioner's table wearing stolen pearls and performing concern while trying to steal more, and Caroline handed copies to the clerk who handed them to Bradley, who opened the folder and went from pale to gray, from confused to horrified, from confident to completely, utterly, irrevocably fucked, and I watched his face, watched the exact moment he understood, watched him realize that he'd been lied to, that his client had committed crimes, that the woman he'd just called mentally incompetent was actually the person who'd caught those crimes, documented those crimes, built a case that was about to destroy not just this petition but his client's entire life. And I felt something then, not satisfaction exactly, not joy, just the cold, clear certainty that justice was possible, that truth could win, that patience and documentation and refusing to stoop to their level was about to pay off in ways they couldn't imagine. And I sat there, still silent, still waiting, because the trap had been sprung. The evidence was being presented, and all I had to do was watch, was wait, was let my work speak for itself, was let the paper trail I'd built tell the story my grandmother had been too ashamed to tell, the story of how her own daughter had robbed her, had manipulated her, had preyed on her declining cognition, had stolen $47,850 over 11 months, had forged documents, had used a retired notary's stamp, had committed felonies, federal felonies, the kind that came with prison time, and they were about to learn that lesson the hard way, about to discover that the quiet daughter they'd underestimated had become exactly the kind of enemy you never want to make, the kind who doesn't scream, doesn't threaten, doesn't warn, just build a case so airtight, so documented, so absolutely unbeatable that when the trap closes there's no escape, no excuse, no way out except through consequences they'd spend years regretting, and sitting there watching Bradley read through evidence that was destroying his case in real time, watching my mother's confident expression crack and fall and shatter into something like panic, watching Theodore go very still the way predators do when they realize they've been caught. I understood what my grandmother had meant when she'd written in her journal that she knew I would win, that she'd always known I was stronger than her, because I'd survived them. Survived abandonment, survived 19 years without a mother, survived building a life from nothing with only my grandmother's love as foundation, and that surviving, that thriving, that becoming someone who could fight back, that was the real inheritance, that was what Dorothy had really left me, not money, not a house, but proof that I was capable, was strong, was exactly the kind of person who could stand in a courtroom while being called mentally incompetent and not flinch, not break, not give them the satisfaction of a reaction, because I didn't need to react, didn't need to defend myself, just needed to wait for the truth to speak. And it was speaking now, speaking loudly, speaking clearly, speaking in bank records and journal entries and forged documents, and everyone in that courtroom was finally listening. Caroline began with the bank records, laid them out methodically, professionally. The way you present evidence when you know it's ironclad, when you know every number has been verified 3 times, when you know that what you're about to say will end the case, will destroy the opposition, will prove beyond any doubt who the real criminal is. And she walked through the timeline, her voice calm, factual, clinical. 7 withdrawals over 11 months, she said, totaling $47,850. Each withdrawal occurring within 3 days of a documented visit from Daisy Hollister to her mother's home in Eau Claire, each withdrawal made in cash, none of them matching any of Dorothy Bergman's regular expenses, no utility bills, no pharmacy charges, no grocery stores, just cash, large amounts of cash, disappearing from the account of an 81-year-old woman who was experiencing mild cognitive decline, who was vulnerable, who was being systematically robbed by her own daughter. And Caroline pulled up the bank statements on the screen, projected them large enough for everyone to see, the dates highlighted in yellow, the amount circled in red, the patterns so obvious, so clear, so undeniable that even Bradley, even my mother's own lawyer, couldn't look away, couldn't deny what he was seeing, couldn't pretend this was normal, was explainable, was anything other than exactly what it looked like, which was theft, was exploitation, was a daughter preying on her mother's confusion and taking money that wasn't hers, money that had been saved penny by penny over 36 years of teaching third graders to read, money that was supposed to go to the granddaughter who'd actually earned it, who'd actually been there, who'd actually loved Dorothy, without conditions, without calculations, without constantly asking what's in it for me. I watched my mother's face as Caroline presented each withdrawal, watched her expression cycle through denial, then confusion, then something that looked almost like indignation, like she was offended that her theft was being called theft, like she convinced herself that taking money from her dying mother was somehow acceptable, somehow justified, somehow her right because she'd given birth to me 33 years ago and that entitled her to everything, to Dorothy's savings, to my inheritance, to rewriting history so thoroughly that she became the victim and I became the villain. But the numbers didn't lie, couldn't lie, wouldn't cooperate with her narrative. They just sat there on the screen, stark and clear and absolutely damning, $47,850, and Caroline kept going, kept presenting, kept building because the bank records were just the beginning, were just the foundation. The case got so much worse from there, got darker, got more calculated, got more deliberately cruel. And I knew what was coming next, knew because I'd built this case, had organized this evidence, had spent 6 weeks preparing for this exact moment. And I watched Bradley's hands shake slightly as he turned pages. As he saw what was coming, as he understood that his client hadn't just stolen money, had committed crimes that were federal, that were serious, that came with prison time, real prison time, the kind you can't negotiate away, can't explain away, can't make disappear with apologies and excuses and performances of concern. Caroline presented the power of attorney document next, the one my mother had gotten Dorothy to sign during what my grandmother had described in her journal as a bad day, a foggy day, a day when her mind wasn't clear, and she'd signed papers she didn't understand because her daughter, her own daughter, had told her would make things easier, would help with managing finances, would be helpful, would be good, except it wasn't good, wasn't helpful, was actually a weapon, was actually a tool for accessing Dorothy's accounts, for making withdrawals, for taking control, and Caroline held up the document, pointed to the notary stamp, the official-looking seal that made everything legal, made everything binding, except Caroline said, her voice sharp now, cutting, "This notary stamp belongs to Raymond Gustafson, who retired from practice in October 2019 and surrendered his commission. This document is dated March 2024, 4.5 years after Mr. Gustafson stopped being a notary, which means this document, this power of attorney that gave Daisy Hollister control over her mother's finances, this document is a forgery, is falsified, is a felony under Wisconsin law and under federal law, and the use of this forged document to access bank accounts, to make withdrawals, to move money, that's wire fraud, that's mail fraud, that's exactly the kind of crime that gets investigated by the FBI. And I watched Bradley's face go from gray to white, watched him realize that he wasn't just losing a probate case. He was sitting next to someone who'd committed multiple felonies, who'd involved him in those felonies by having him file this petition, who'd lied to him so completely that he was now part of a criminal conspiracy, and the panic in his eyes, the absolute terror, it was almost worth the months of stress, the months of being benched at work, the months of having my competency questioned, almost worth it just to see him understand that believing your client without verification, that trusting someone's story without doing basic research, that assuming the quiet daughter was the problem instead of the concerned mother, that those assumptions had consequences, had just destroyed his case and possibly his career. Because how do you come back from this? How do you explain to future clients that you once represented someone in a case where your client was actually the criminal, where the person you'd called mentally incompetent was actually the fraud examiner who caught your client, where everything you'd argued was backwards, was inverted, was so completely wrong that it became a cautionary tale other lawyers would tell to warn against lazy investigation, against trusting manipulative clients, against walking into court unprepared. But Caroline wasn't done, wasn't close to done, because the forged power of attorney was bad, was criminal, was enough to destroy the case. But it wasn't the worst thing, wasn't the most damning piece of evidence, wasn't the thing that would make this case memorable, that would make Judge Kowalski's face harden, that would make my mother realize she wasn't just losing an inheritance, she was losing her freedom, her life, her future, everything she'd built on stolen money and abandoned children, and the belief that she could take whatever she wanted without consequences. And Caroline pulled out the journal, My grandmother's journal, brown leather, worn, filled with Dorothy's careful handwriting, documentation of everything, every visit, every request for money, every lie, every manipulation, every moment of confusion that had been exploited, every shame-filled realization that she'd been tricked by her own daughter. And Caroline read selected entries aloud, her voice steady, professional, but each word landing like a hammer, like a judgment, like Dorothy herself speaking from beyond the grave to finally tell the truth about what had been done to her. And the first entry made me bite the inside of my cheek to keep from crying, made me remember finding this journal in the safe deposit box, made me remember reading Dorothy's words and understanding that she'd known, had documented, had left me this weapon because she'd been too ashamed to use it herself, too proud to admit she'd been fooled, too afraid of looking weak, of looking old, of looking like she needed help. So she'd written it all down, had created a paper trail, had given me exactly what I needed to fight back, to win, to make sure that her daughter, her terrible daughter who'd abandoned one child and robbed one mother, would face consequences, would learn that stealing from the woman who raised you, who taught you, who loved you, that stealing from that woman had costs, had prices, had justice waiting at the end. Caroline read the entry from August. Daisy called today, first time in years, sounding sweet, apologetic, saying she wanted to reconnect, saying she'd made mistakes. I don't trust it, but I'm old and tired and maybe people can change. And then the entry from October. Daisy visited, asked to borrow $2,000 for an emergency. I gave it to her. She cried and hugged me and promised to pay it back. She won't pay it back. I know she won't. But what do you do when your daughter asks for help? Even when you know she's lying, even when you know she's using you, you still want to believe, you still want to hope, you still want to be the kind of mother whose daughter comes back. Even if she only comes back for money. And reading that, hearing Dorothy's words, understanding the depth of her pain, the complexity of her feelings, the way she'd loved her daughter, even while knowing that daughter was destroying her, it made my chest tight, made my throat close, made me understand why. Dorothy had left everything to me, not because she loved me more, though maybe she did, but because she knew I'd fight, knew I wouldn't let Daisy win, knew I'd use these entries to make sure that what had been done in darkness, in secret, in shame, would be brought into light, into court, into public record where everyone could see exactly what kind of person my mother was, what kind of things she was capable of, what kind of pain she was willing to inflict on the woman who'd raised her, who'd loved her, who taught her the difference between right and wrong and watched her choose wrong, choose theft, choose cruelty, choose money over morality every single time. The entries got darker as Caroline read, October visit. Daisy said Theodore was sick, needed help with medical bills, gave her $4,000. December visit. Daisy brought Theodore. They had papers for me to sign, said it would make it easier for them to help me manage my finances. I signed them. My mind was foggy that day. I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to, and then 2 weeks later, a good day, looked at the papers I'd signed, realized they were power of attorney, giving Daisy control over my accounts. I'm too ashamed to tell Nancy, don't want her to see me as weak, don't want her to know I was fooled. And that line, that admission of shame, that's what broke me, broke something in me that I'd been holding together through sheer force of will, through professionalism, through the need to stay calm, to stay focused, to win this case, because Dorothy hadn't told me, hadn't asked for help, hadn't said anything about what was happening because she was ashamed, because she thought being manipulated by her own daughter meant she was weak, meant she was failing, meant she was the problem, and she'd carried that shame, had suffered with it, had documented her own exploitation in a journal she kept hidden because she couldn't bear for me to know, couldn't stand the thought of me seeing her as anything less than the strong, capable, careful woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me everything, who'd been my foundation when my mother had abandoned me. And knowing that Dorothy had protected me from this knowledge, had kept this secret, had borne this pain alone, it made me hate my mother in a way I hadn't known I was capable of, made me understand that what she'd done wasn't just theft, wasn't just forgery, wasn't just financial crimes. It was betrayal, was cruelty, was the systematic destruction of a woman's dignity, of her independence, of her sense of self, taking not just her money but her confidence, her pride, her ability to trust her own judgment, and that taking, that theft of personhood, that was worse than any dollar amount, was worse than any financial loss, was the kind of crime that couldn't be measured in restitution, could only be answered with justice, with consequences, with making absolutely certain that my mother would spend years, real years, significant years, in federal prison understanding exactly what she'd done, exactly who she'd hurt, exactly what she destroyed in her pursuit of money that wasn't hers, that had never been hers, that she had no moral or legal claim to despite what she'd convinced herself in whatever twisted internal narrative let her sleep at night. The courtroom was completely silent as Caroline finished reading the final entry, the one addressed to me. "I'm sorry, Nancy. I tried to tell you several times but couldn't find the words. I know Daisy will come for the money after I'm gone, and I wanted you to have proof. I wanted you to fight. I've always known you were stronger than me. That's why I know you'll win." And Caroline closed the journal carefully, reverently, set it on the table like the sacred object it was, like the testament it represented, like the weapon Dorothy had forged in secret and left for me to wield. And she looked at Judge Kowalski, looked at Bradley, looked at my mother, who was no longer performing concern, was no longer arranging her features into appropriate expressions, was just sitting there with her mouth slightly open, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table like she was trying to keep herself from falling, from collapsing, from running. And Caroline said, her voice still professional, but with an edge now, with steel, "Your Honor, this isn't a case about a concerned mother trying to protect a mentally incompetent daughter. This is a case about a daughter who abandoned her child 19 years ago, who ignored her mother for 15 years, who only reached out when she needed money, who systematically exploited a vulnerable elderly woman, who forged legal documents, who stole nearly $50,000, who committed multiple felonies, and who is now trying to use the legal system to steal more, to finish what she started, to take everything her mother left to the granddaughter, who actually loved her, who actually cared for her, who actually deserves it. And this court needs to understand that the woman sitting at the petitioner's table isn't a concerned mother. She's a criminal, and the woman she's calling mentally incompetent, that's the fraud examiner who caught her, who documented everything, who built this case, who's testified as an expert witness in this very courtroom 11 times, who Judge Kowalski herself has called one of the most credible witnesses she's encountered, and perhaps Mr. Fenwick should have done even the most basic Google search before filing this petition, before making these accusations, before walking into this courtroom thinking he could call a certified fraud examiner mentally incompetent without consequences. Judge Kowalski removed her reading glasses, cleaned them slowly, deliberately, the gesture buying time, buying space, buying a moment to process what she'd just heard, what had just been presented, what had just exploded in her courtroom. And when she put her glasses back on and looked at Bradley, the expression on her face was one I'd seen before, seen when evidence revealed something unexpected, something that changed the entire trajectory of a case, something that meant what had started as one kind of proceeding was now something else entirely. And she said, her voice measured, careful, "Mr. Fenwick, I'm going to give you an opportunity to confer with your client, to review the evidence that's been presented, to decide how you want to proceed, but I need you to understand that what's been presented here today isn't just relevant to this probate matter. It's evidence of potentially serious criminal conduct, and this court has an obligation to refer such matters to the appropriate authorities, so you and your client need to think very carefully about what you say next, about what claims you continue to make, about whether you want to proceed with this petition or whether you'd like to withdraw it and deal with the larger issues that are now unavoidably on the record." And she called a 15-minute recess, stood, left the bench, left Bradley sitting there with papers scattered in front of him and a client who'd just been exposed as a criminal and a case that had gone from seemingly simple to catastrophically complicated in the span of 30 minutes. And I watched Bradley turn to my mother, watched him lean close, watched him whisper urgently, watched her face cycle through emotions too fast to track, denial, anger, fear, panic, more fear, the realization settling over her features like a mask, like a death sentence, that she'd miscalculated, had underestimated, had brought a daughter to court who'd spent 7 years learning how to destroy exactly this kind of scheme, who'd sat across from criminals more sophisticated than her and made them confess, made them break, made them understand that paper trails don't lie, that documentation defeats deception, That patience and preparation beat performance every single time, and I'd waited, had stayed silent, had let them build their case, commit to their lies, paint me as mentally incompetent, and only then, only after they'd committed completely, had I shown them who I really was, what I really did, what I was really capable of, and the trap had closed perfectly, had destroyed them completely, had left them with no exit, no excuse, no way forward except through consequences they'd spend years regretting, and sitting there watching my mother understand this, watching her realize that the quiet daughter she'd thrown away like garbage was actually the person who would send her to prison. Watching that realization dawn and settle and crush her, I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction, wasn't quite joy, was just the cold, clear certainty that justice was possible, that evil could be punished, that sometimes if you were patient enough, careful enough, prepared enough, the people who hurt you would finally face the consequences they'd spent years avoiding, and those consequences were about to be severe, were about to be public, were about to follow my mother for the rest of her life. Because after today, after this hearing, after this evidence became part of the record, there would be no hiding, no pretending, no rewriting history, just truth, documented truth, the kind that doesn't fade, doesn't change, doesn't bend to accommodate the stories people tell themselves to justify their cruelty. And that truth was about to destroy everything my mother had built on lies, on theft, on the broken trust of a woman who'd loved her and been betrayed for it. The 15-minute recess felt like hours, felt like days, felt like time had slowed down and stretched out and was forcing me to sit with the weight of what had just happened, what was still happening, what was about to happen, and I couldn't stay in the courtroom, couldn't sit at that table anymore, needed to move, needed air, needed space away from my mother's panic and Bradley's urgent whispered conversations and the suffocating atmosphere of lies collapsing. So I walked out into the hallway, 4th floor of the Milwaukee County Courthouse, industrial carpet, fluorescent lights, the kind of anonymous government space that witnessed thousands of life-changing moments and absorbed none of them. And Cameron was there, my boyfriend Cameron, who taught high school history and came from the kind of normal family that still had Sunday dinners, who'd been sitting in the back row watching everything, and he stood when he saw me, opened his arms, and I walked into them, pressed my face against his shoulder, breathed in the smell of his cologne and laundry detergent and normalcy, and he said quietly, his voice careful, "You okay?" And I laughed, couldn't help it. The question was so absurd, so inadequate, so completely insufficient for what I was experiencing. And I said, I don't know if I'm okay. I don't know what okay means anymore. I just destroyed my mother's entire life in there, presented evidence that's going to send her to federal prison, and I should feel something, should feel satisfied or vindicated or powerful, but I just feel tired, just feel empty, just feel like I'm standing at the end of something and the beginning of something else, and I don't know what either of those things are. And Cameron held me tighter, said you did what you had to do, said she made her choices, said you're not responsible for her consequences, and I knew he was right, knew intellectually that I'd done nothing wrong, that I'd simply presented truth, that I'd simply defended myself, that everything that was happening to my mother was her own fault, her own doing, her own choices catching up with her. But knowing it intellectually and feeling it emotionally were different things. And I was caught between both, caught between the cold satisfaction of winning and the strange grief of losing a mother I'd already lost 19 years ago, except losing her again, losing her permanently, losing her to prison and consequences, and the permanent record of her crimes that felt different, felt final, felt like closing a door I hadn't realized I'd been keeping slightly open, hadn't realized I'd been hoping might someday lead somewhere that wasn't this, that wasn't courtroom destruction, that wasn't me presenting evidence of my own mother's cruelty to a judge. But that door was closing now, was slamming shut, and whatever small hope I'd been carrying without realizing it, that hope was dying. And I needed to let it, needed to accept it, needed to understand that this was the ending, this was how it finished, not with reconciliation but with justice, not with healing but with consequences, not with family reunion but with permanent separation. And that separation, that finality, it was right, was necessary, was exactly what needed to happen, but it still hurt in ways I hadn't anticipated, in ways I wasn't prepared for, in ways that made me understand that grief is complicated, is messy, is possible even for relationships that were never good, were never healthy, were never anything except painful. I need to pause here for just a moment because I need you to understand something, need you to really hear this. If you're watching this story and you've ever had to choose between protecting yourself and protecting a relationship with someone who hurt you, if you've ever had to decide whether to expose someone's crimes even though exposing them meant losing them forever, type necessary if you've been there. Type justice if you know that sometimes doing the right thing feels terrible, because I need you to see that this wasn't easy, wasn't simple, wasn't just cold, calculated revenge. It was survival, was protection, was me finally understanding that some people are dangerous, are destructive, are incapable of change, and the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for everyone else they might hurt is to stop them, to expose them, to make sure their consequences finally catch up with them. And from our stats, we've got way more viewers than subscribers if you're following this. If you need to see how this ends, if you need proof that patience and documentation can beat manipulation and lies, kindly join our community and hit that subscribe button, because what happens when we go back into that courtroom, what happens when Judge Kowalski returns, what happens when my mother has to make a choice about whether to continue lying or finally admit the truth, that's coming, and you need to see it. Need to understand that sometimes justice is slow, but it's real, it's possible. It's worth fighting for, even when fighting means destroying people who share your DNA, who raised you, who are supposed to love you but only know how to use you. So stay with me, because this is where everything changes, where the case goes from civil matter to criminal investigation, where my mother learns that stealing from vulnerable people has costs she never imagined, and those costs are about to become very, very real. When we went back into the courtroom, when the bailiff called "All rise" and Judge Kowalski returned to the bench, the atmosphere had changed completely. The earlier confidence from the petitioner's table had evaporated, had been replaced by something that looked like barely controlled panic. My mother kept whispering to Bradley, kept touching his arm, kept trying to get him to look at her, to reassure her, to tell her this was fixable. But Bradley wasn't looking at her, wasn't making eye contact, was sitting rigid in his chair staring at his notes like they might contain some magical solution, some argument that could undo the evidence Caroline had presented, some way to explain away bank records and forged documents and Dorothy's journal. But there wasn't a way, wasn't an explanation, wasn't anything except the truth, and the truth was damning, was absolute, was sitting in a folder in front of the judge who'd spent 15 minutes reviewing it, verifying it, understanding exactly what it meant. And when Judge Kowalski spoke, her voice was different than it had been before the recess, was harder, was colder, had lost any trace of neutrality and gained something that sounded almost like controlled anger. The anger that comes from seeing your courtroom used as a weapon, from watching someone try to manipulate the legal system, from understanding that an innocent person had been dragged here, had been publicly accused of mental incompetence, had been forced to defend themselves against lies, and all of it had been done by someone who was themselves committing the exact crimes they were accusing someone else of. And judges hate that, hate being used, hate being lied to, hate wasting court time on cases built on fraud. And Judge Kowalski had just figured out that's exactly what had happened, that she'd been played, or that someone had tried to play her, had tried to use her authority to steal from someone who actually deserved protection. And that understanding, that realization, it was about to have consequences for my mother that went far beyond losing this case, far beyond losing the inheritance, far beyond anything she'd anticipated when she'd filed this petition. Judge Kowalski looked at Bradley and said, "Mr. Fenwick, has your client made a decision about how she wishes to proceed? Do you want to withdraw the petition, or do you want to continue?" And there was something in the way she asked it, something in her tone, that made it clear there was only one right answer, only one path forward that didn't make everything worse. But Bradley looked at my mother, looked at her panicked expression, looked at her shaking her head slightly, and he made the worst possible choice, the choice that would seal everything, would guarantee the referral to federal prosecutors, would ensure this became not just a failed civil case but a criminal investigation. He said, "We'd like to continue, Your Honor. We believe there may have been misunderstandings about some of the financial transactions. We'd like the opportunity to present evidence that explains the circumstances." And I watched Caroline's eyebrows raise slightly, watched her make a note on her legal pad, watched her exchange a look with me that said, "They're really going to do this. They're really going to keep lying. They're really going to make this worse." And I understood then that my mother had learned nothing, had absorbed nothing, had sat through that evidence presentation, and somehow convinced herself that she could still talk her way out of it, could still perform her way through it, could still manipulate and explain and reframe until somehow the truth became negotiable, became debatable, became something other than what it obviously was, and that inability to accept reality, that insistence on continuing to lie even when caught, even when exposed, even when the evidence was overwhelming, it was pathological, was beyond normal selfishness, was the behavior of someone who'd spent so long lying to herself that she'd lost the ability to distinguish truth from fiction, fact from narrative, crime from justified action. Judge Kowalski nodded slowly, deliberately, said, "Very well, Mr. Fenwick, please present your evidence," and Bradley stood, shuffled papers, clearly unprepared for this, clearly hoping they'd withdraw, clearly not expecting to actually have to continue arguing a case that was so thoroughly destroyed, and he started talking, started trying to explain the withdrawals as loans that Dorothy had insisted on giving, as help that had been requested, as family support that was normal, was appropriate, was what any daughter would do, and it was painful to watch, was embarrassing, was like watching someone dig their own grave while insisting they were building a foundation, and Caroline let him talk for maybe 3 minutes before she stood and said objectively, "Your Honor, if these were loans, where is the documentation? Where are the promissory notes? Where is any evidence that repayment was ever expected or discussed? And if these were gifts that Dorothy insisted on giving, why did she document them in her private journal as theft? Why did she write that she felt manipulated? Why did she express shame and confusion? And if this was normal family support, why did it only begin after Dorothy started showing signs of cognitive decline? Why did it accelerate in frequency and amount as her condition worsened? Why did it follow the exact pattern we see in classic elder financial exploitation cases? And Caroline pulled out more documents, more evidence I'd gathered, documentation I'd spent weeks assembling, bank records from before the exploitation started showing regular patterns, then the disruption of those patterns, then the acceleration of withdrawals, the classic trajectory of financial abuse, and she presented it like the expert she was, like someone who'd seen this pattern dozens of times, who'd prosecuted these cases, who knew exactly what predatory behavior looked like. And Bradley had no response, had nothing, just stood there looking at papers he hadn't prepared for, defending a client who'd lied to him, fighting a case he'd already lost but was too stubborn or too foolish to abandon. My mother stood then, unexpected, without Bradley telling her to, without asking permission, just stood up and said, her voice loud, carrying across the courtroom, "Your Honor, I need to speak. I need to explain. This is all wrong. My daughter has twisted everything. She's always been difficult, always been manipulative, always made me look bad. She turned my own mother against me, isolated her, made her think I was stealing when I was just helping, when I was just being a good daughter, and..." Dorothy was confused. She didn't understand what she was writing, didn't understand what she was signing, and yes, maybe the notary stamp was old, but that was an innocent mistake. We didn't know it had expired. We thought it was fine, and the money was for medical expenses, was for things Dorothy needed, was for her care, and if Nancy had actually been taking care of her properly instead of controlling her, instead of keeping her away from her family, none of this would have happened. And I watched this performance, watched her perform victimhood, watched her try to reframe abuse as care, theft as help, my love for my grandmother as control, and I felt something cold settle in my chest, felt the last tiny piece of hope I'd been carrying die completely, because this wasn't someone who'd made mistakes and was sorry. This wasn't someone who'd acted out of desperation and regretted it. This was someone who genuinely believed her own lies, who'd rewritten reality so thoroughly that she couldn't see truth anymore, couldn't access it, couldn't recognize it, and there was no reaching someone like that, no redeeming them, no possibility of change or growth or accountability. There was just her standing in a courtroom lying to a judge while evidence of her crimes sat on the bench in front of her, and I understood with perfect clarity that cutting her off 19 years ago, that being abandoned by her, that had been a gift, had been protection, had saved me from spending my entire life trying to earn love from someone who was incapable of giving it, who saw people as resources, as tools, as things to be used and discarded when they stopped being useful, and I'd been discarded, had been thrown away, and at the time it had destroyed me. But now, watching her, I understood it had saved me, had protected me from becoming complicit in her crimes, from being shaped by her values, from learning that love meant manipulation and family meant theft. And relationships meant calculating what you could get from people. Judge Kowalski let my mother finish. Let her say everything she wanted to say. Let her commit fully to this version of events. And when the courtroom finally went quiet, when my mother sat down breathing hard like she'd just run a marathon, Judge Kowalski looked at her with an expression I'd never seen on a judge's face before. Not in 38 cases. Not in 7 years of testifying. It was contempt. Was absolute professional contempt. The look you give someone who's so thoroughly wasted your time, so completely insulted your intelligence, so obviously lied to your face that you can't maintain the neutral judicial demeanor anymore. And she said, her voice icy, "Mrs. Hollister, I have sat on this bench for 22 years. I have heard every excuse, every justification, every attempt to reframe elder abuse as care, and what you've just done, what you've just said, that ranks among the most egregious. I have in front of me bank records showing systematic withdrawal of funds. I have a journal written by your own mother documenting your manipulation. I have a forged legal document bearing a notary seal that was invalid when you used it. I have expert testimony from your own daughter, who you called mentally incompetent, who is actually a certified fraud examiner I've worked with multiple times, who has testified in my courtroom 11 times, who I've personally commended on the record for her credibility and expertise, and you're standing here telling me that she's the problem, that she's manipulative, that she turned your mother against you when the evidence, all of the evidence, every single piece of documentation, shows that you systematically exploited a vulnerable elderly woman, stole nearly $50,000, forged legal documents, and are now trying to steal more through this court." And Judge Kowalski paused. Let that sink in. Let my mother understand that she'd miscalculated catastrophically. And then she continued, "I'm denying your petition. Mrs. Hollister, I'm denying it with prejudice, which means you cannot file it again, cannot bring these claims back, cannot use this court to harass your daughter further. And more than that, I'm referring this entire matter to the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office for investigation of potential criminal charges including theft, forgery, and elder financial exploitation. And I'm also referring it to the FBI field office in Milwaukee because the use of forged documents to access bank accounts, to make interstate transfers, that constitutes wire fraud and mail fraud, which are federal crimes. And finally, I'm ordering you to return the pearl earrings you're currently wearing, which I've been informed belong to Dorothy Bergman and were not left to you in her will, which means you're currently wearing stolen property in my courtroom. So you'll remove those earrings immediately and give them to the bailiff, who will return them to Ms. Bergman." And I watched my mother's hands go to her ears, watched her touch the pearls like she'd forgotten she was wearing them, watched her face cycle through disbelief and then anger and then something like despair, and she took them off slowly, reluctantly, handed them to the bailiff, who walked them over to me, and I held them in my palm. These pearls that my grandmother had worn for 40 years, that had been stolen during one of those concerned visits, that had been worn by my mother in this courtroom like a trophy, like evidence of her victory, and getting them back felt like something, felt like a small justice, felt like Dorothy reaching through death to reclaim what was hers, to give it to the granddaughter who deserved it, who'd earned it, who'd fought for it. And I closed my fingers around them and felt the cool, smooth surface and understood that this was over. The case was over, the fight was over, and I'd won, completely, absolutely, irrevocably. And my mother had lost everything, her case, her credibility, her freedom, all of it gone in 2 hours, gone because she'd underestimated, had miscalculated, had believed her own lies so thoroughly that she'd walked into a courtroom thinking she could convince a judge that the fraud examiner was the fraud, and that believing, that confidence, that absolute certainty in her own narrative despite all evidence to the contrary, it had destroyed her, had made her vulnerable, had created the perfect trap, and she'd walked right into it, had committed fully, had given Judge Kowalski everything needed to not just deny the petition but to refer the case to prosecutors who would have the power to put her in prison, real prison, federal prison for years, and all of it, all of the destruction that was coming she'd done to herself, had chosen, had earned through decades of being someone who took what wasn't hers, who used what wasn't hers to use, who saw vulnerable people as opportunities rather than as humans deserving of dignity. And now, finally, after years of getting away with it, after years of facing no consequences, the bill had come due, and it was going to cost her everything. The courtroom cleared slowly after Judge Kowalski's ruling, people filing out in that awkward shuffle that happens when something dramatic has just occurred and nobody knows quite what to say, what to do, how to process what they've witnessed, and my mother sat at the petitioner's table not moving, just staring at the wood grain like she was trying to read something in it, trying to find meaning, trying to understand how she'd walked in here confident and was leaving destroyed. And Theodore, her husband Theodore, who'd been sitting quietly through the whole proceeding looking like a man who'd been through this before, who knew when a game was over, he touched her shoulder once, tried to get her to stand, to leave, to move, but she shook him off, just kept sitting there, and I wondered what she was thinking, whether she was replaying the morning, replaying her decision to file this petition, replaying the moment when she'd seen my grandmother's estate, seen those numbers, seen opportunity where she should have seen consequences, or whether she was already rewriting it in her head, already constructing a narrative where she was the victim, where I was the villain, where somehow this wasn't her fault, wasn't her choice, wasn't the natural result of decades of being someone who took and never faced accountability until now, until this courtroom. Bradley packed his briefcase quickly, efficiently, the movements of someone who wanted to be anywhere else, who regretted taking this case, who was probably already calculating how to minimize the damage to his reputation, how to explain to his firm that he'd filed a petition calling a fraud examiner mentally incompetent without doing basic research, without verifying his client's story, without understanding who he was actually fighting, and as he stood to leave he looked at me once, just once. And I saw something in his expression that might have been apology, might have been respect, might have been the recognition that he'd learned an expensive lesson about trusting clients, about doing due diligence, about the importance of knowing who's sitting across from you before you make accusations. And then he was gone, was walking out, leaving my mother sitting there alone because even her own lawyer knew better than to stay. Knew better than to keep associating himself with someone who was about to become a federal case, who was about to have her name in databases, who was about to be someone other lawyers would reference as a cautionary tale, as an example of what happens when you commit crimes and then try to use the legal system to commit more. Caroline touched my arm, said we should go, said we need to let them process this, said there's nothing more to do here, and she was right. The case was over, the ruling was made, the referrals were filed, and sitting here watching my mother not move, not react, not leave, that wasn't helping anyone, wasn't serving any purpose, was just prolonging something that needed to end. So I stood, gathered my things, put my grandmother's pearls carefully in my purse where they belonged, where they should have stayed, where they would stay now permanently, and I walked out of that courtroom with Cameron beside me and Caroline ahead of me, and I didn't look back, didn't give my mother the satisfaction of seeing me watch her, didn't give her any more of my attention, my energy, my life, because she'd already taken 19 years, had already taken my childhood in some ways, had already taken the possibility of having a mother who loved me, who chose me, who showed up for me, and I wasn't. Giving her another second, another thought, another moment of power over my emotional state, I was done, completely, finally, irrevocably done, and walking out of that courtroom felt like walking out of a burning building, felt like escape, felt like survival, felt like I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale, could finally breathe, could finally exist without the weight of this case, this accusation, this threat hanging over me, threatening my career, my reputation, my sense of self. And the relief was overwhelming, was physical, made my legs weak, made me need to sit on a bench in the hallway for a moment, made Cameron kneel in front of me with concern in his eyes asking if I was okay, if I needed water, if I needed anything, and I said I'm fine, I need a minute, I need to understand that it's over, that I won, that she can't hurt me anymore, can't touch me, can't use the legal system against me, can't do anything except face consequences, real consequences, permanent consequences, and that understanding, that realization, it was too big to process standing up, too big to carry while walking, needed me to sit, to breathe, to let it wash over me in waves. 3 days after the hearing, Special Agent Tina Morales called me, introduced herself as FBI, Milwaukee Field Office, White Collar Crimes Division, said she'd received the referral from Judge Kowalski, had reviewed the evidence package Caroline had submitted, had pulled financial records going back years, and said, Ms. Bergman, I need you to know that what you've documented here, what you've built, this is one of the clearest cases of elder financial exploitation I've seen in 15 years with the Bureau. Your grandmother's journal alone would be enough to move forward, but combined with the bank records, the forged power of attorney, the pattern you've identified, This is prosecutable. This is winnable. And we're opening a formal investigation. And hearing the FBI confirm what I'd known, what I'd documented, what I'd proven, it felt like validation, felt like vindication, felt like someone with authority and power was finally saying, yes, you're right, yes. This was abuse. Yes, what happened to your grandmother was criminal. And we're going to do something about it. We're going to make sure the people who did this face federal charges, face real prison time, face consequences that are proportional to the harm they caused. And Agent Morales kept talking, said we've also pulled financial records for Theodore Hollister, said we're finding patterns that go back further than your grandmother's case, said there are irregularities in how his mother's estate was handled in 2017, said there may be other victims, said this investigation is expanding, and I sat there listening, understanding that what I'd thought was just my grandmother's case, just my mother's crimes, was actually bigger, was actually part of a pattern, was actually something Theodore had been doing for years, decades maybe, targeting vulnerable elderly women, draining their accounts, forging documents, stealing inheritances, and my mother hadn't corrupted him. He'd corrupted her, had taught her, had brought her into his operation, had made her complicit in crimes that had been going on since before they'd met. And my grandmother, my sweet, careful grandmother, who'd tracked every penny, she'd just been the most recent victim, the latest target, the newest source of money for people who saw elderly confusion not as something deserving of protection but as something deserving of exploitation. Agent Morales asked me to come to her office the following week, said she wanted to go through my documentation in detail, wanted to understand my methodology, wanted to learn how I'd identified the patterns, tracked the timeline, built the case, because apparently my work, my organization, my 7 years of experience as a fraud examiner had created something prosecutors could use, something that met evidentiary standards, something that would hold up in federal court. And she said, her voice warm, approving, I've read your testimony transcripts, Ms. Bergman, from your other cases, and Judge Kowalski wasn't exaggerating when she called you credible, you're thorough, you're precise, you're exactly the kind of witness prosecutors love, and I'll be honest, having you as the victim in this case, having your expertise, having your documentation, it makes our job significantly easier. Most elder abuse cases are hard to prove because the victims are too confused to testify, too ashamed to come forward, too dead to tell their story, but your grandmother left a journal, and you have the expertise to contextualize it, to connect it to financial evidence, to build a case that's almost impossible to defend against. And that combination, that's powerful, that's rare. That's exactly what we need to put these people away for a very long time. And hearing someone understand not just what my grandmother had experienced, but what I'd built, what I'd created, what I'd spent weeks assembling, that felt like recognition, felt like respect, felt like all those nights staying up late organizing documents, verifying dates, cross-referencing bank statements. All of that work mattered, was valued, was going to be the foundation for justice, not just for Dorothy, but for everyone else Theodore and Daisy had hurt, everyone else whose stories hadn't been documented, whose pain hadn't been witnessed, whose losses hadn't been avenged, and I was going to be part of that avenging, was going to testify, was going to present evidence, was going to make sure that my grandmother's death, her suffering, her shame, wouldn't be meaningless, would serve a purpose, would protect other people, would stop predators who thought they could take whatever they wanted without consequences. The investigation moved faster than I expected, faster than most federal cases, because apparently when you have someone who's documented everything, who's organized evidence according to prosecutorial standards, who's essentially done half the FBI's job for them, cases move quickly. And Agent Morales called me 6 weeks after the hearing, said they're ready to move, said grand jury indictments are coming, said federal charges including wire fraud, mail fraud, financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, forgery, conspiracy, said the indictment is 18 pages long, said every transaction we can prove is charged separately, said your mother is looking at 5 to 8 years, said Theodore is looking at longer because of the pattern, because of his mother's case, because of evidence we found suggesting there may have been other victims we're still investigating. And hearing those numbers, 5 to 8 years, understanding that my mother was going to federal prison, was going to lose years of her life, was going to experience consequences that were real, that were severe, that were exactly what she deserved, I felt something complicated, felt satisfaction, yes, felt vindication, yes, but also something like grief, like mourning, like the final death of any possibility that this would end differently, that somehow we'd find our way to reconciliation, to understanding, to family. And I knew that hope had been foolish, had been based on fantasy rather than reality, had been the last desperate wish of a daughter who'd spent her whole life wanting a mother who loved her, but letting go of foolish hope still hurt, still felt like loss, still required mourning, even though what I was mourning had never existed in the first place, had always been imagination, had always been what I wished for rather than what actually was. Theodore and Daisy were arrested on April 2nd, just 3 weeks after the indictments, federal marshals showing up at their house, at the small rental they'd moved to after selling the house, after the foreclosure, after their carefully constructed life had collapsed, and I wasn't there, wasn't watching, wasn't participating, but Agent Morales called me after, said they're in custody, said bail hearing is tomorrow, said the prosecutor is arguing for detention because of flight risk, because Theodore has access to resources we haven't found yet because there's evidence of undisclosed accounts, of money hidden in places we're still tracking, and sure enough the judge agreed. No bail, pretrial detention, both of them sitting in federal custody until trial, and I tried to imagine my mother in a cell, tried to picture her without her performance, without her audience, without the ability to manipulate and charm and reframe, just her alone with what she'd done, with who she was with. The reality that she'd destroyed her life through choices she'd made, through greed she'd chosen, through crimes she'd committed, and I couldn't picture it, couldn't make the image resolve, couldn't connect the woman who'd raised me for 14 years with the woman who'd sit in federal prison. But that disconnect, that inability to reconcile the two versions, that wasn't my problem anymore, wasn't my responsibility, wasn't something I needed to figure out because they were the same person, had always been the same person. I'd just been too young, too hopeful, too desperate for love to see it clearly, and now I saw it, saw her, saw exactly who she was, and that seeing, that clarity, it was terrible and necessary, was painful and freeing, was everything I'd needed and everything I'd feared, and I was learning to live with it, to carry it, to build a life that included this knowledge, this truth, this understanding that my mother was a criminal, was a predator, was someone who belonged in prison because prison was where people who hurt vulnerable people belonged, and feeling that, believing that, accepting that it was hard, was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, but it was also right, was also just, was also the only possible response to what she'd done, to who she'd proven herself to be. The firm reinstated me the week after the hearing. My boss, Harold, called me into his office, apologized personally for the administrative review, for the months of being benched, for questioning my credibility, and he said, his voice sincere, "Nancy, I never doubted you, never thought you were actually incompetent, but the firm has insurance requirements, has liability concerns, has to protect itself, and having an expert witness whose competency is being questioned in court, even if we knew the questions were baseless, we couldn't risk it. But now that the case is resolved, now that Judge Kowalski has made that ruling, now that it's clear this was always fraud, we want you back, need you back, you're one of our best, and we have cases waiting." And I looked at him, at this decent man who'd hired me 7 years ago straight out of my certification program, who'd believed in me, who'd given me opportunities, who'd been forced by circumstances to bench me even though he'd known I was right, and I understood that he'd been in an impossible position, had made the only choice he could make, had protected the firm while trying to protect me, and I couldn't blame him for that, couldn't hold it against him, could only accept the apology, accept the reinstatement, accept that sometimes doing the right thing requires patience, requires waiting, requires surviving temporary setbacks while building toward permanent victory, and I'd survived, had waited, had built, and now I was back. Was working again, was testifying again, was doing what I was good at, what I'd trained for, what mattered. And my first case back, the very first case Harold assigned me, was an 84-year-old woman in Kenosha whose nephew had stolen $89,000 from her retirement account. And I dove into it, organized evidence, built timelines, documented patterns, and we got every penny back, got the nephew charged, got 4 years prison time, got justice, and it felt good, felt right. Felt like I was doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing, exactly what my grandmother had trained me for without knowing she was training me, using the skills she'd taught me to protect people like her, people who'd saved carefully, who'd planned prudently, who deserved to age with dignity and security, not to be robbed by people who saw their confusion as opportunity, their trust as weakness, their love as something to exploit. The trial was set for October, 6 months after the arrests. Federal trials move slowly, move carefully, move with the weight of prosecutorial precision, and I was listed as a witness, as an expert witness, as someone who would testify about the patterns, the methodology, the evidence about what elder financial abuse looks like, how it operates, why it works. How my grandmother's case fit perfectly into documented patterns of exploitation, and I spent months preparing, working with the assistant U.S. attorney assigned to the case, a woman named Rebecca Cho, who was sharp, focused, relentless, who'd prosecuted financial crimes for 12 years and had conviction rates that made defense attorneys nervous. And she told me, "You're going to be our star witness," said, "Your testimony is going to connect everything," said, "The journal your grandmother left. That's emotional. That's powerful. That's what makes the jury understand the human cost, but your expertise, your ability to show that this wasn't just one confused old lady. This was systematic predation following known patterns. That's what makes it impossible to defend. That's what takes it from sad family story to criminal prosecution." And I understood what she meant, understood that I was both victim and expert, was both granddaughter seeking justice and professional documenting crime. And that duality, that combination was rare, was powerful, was exactly what prosecutors needed to make cases that were usually hard to prove, usually hard to convict, usually hard to explain to juries who wanted to believe that families don't hurt each other, that daughters don't rob mothers, that the people calling for help are actually the ones being hurt. And my job, my testimony, was going to shatter those comfortable beliefs, was going to show that families can be dangerous, that blood doesn't create loyalty, that sometimes the people who claim to care the most are actually the predators. And juries needed to hear that, needed to understand that, needed to convict based on that understanding, because if they couldn't accept that families can be criminal, then people like my mother, like Theodore, like everyone who preyed on vulnerable elderly people, they'd keep winning, keep stealing, keep destroying lives. And I wasn't going to let that happen. Wasn't going to let my grandmother's suffering be for nothing. Wasn't going to let her shame, her silence, her death mean that other people would suffer the same way. I was going to testify, was going to present evidence, was going to make absolutely certain that the jury understood exactly what had happened, exactly who was guilty, exactly what justice required. And I was going to do it professionally, calmly, thoroughly, the way I'd been trained, the way I'd testified 38 times before. Except this time it was personal, was my family, was my grandmother, was my life. And that personal investment, that emotional connection, I'd have to manage it, control it, channel it into precision rather than letting it become rage, into clarity rather than letting it become pain. And I could do that, had learned how to do that, had spent 7 years learning how to carry personal feelings while presenting objective evidence. And this trial, this testimony, this moment when I'd finally, publicly, completely destroy the people who'd tried to destroy me, that was coming, was inevitable, was going to be the conclusion to a story that had started when I was 14 years old, and my mother had decided I wasn't worth keeping. And now, 19 years later, I was going to prove that the daughter she'd thrown away was actually the person who'd sent her to prison. And that proving, that demonstration, that final absolute victory, it was going to feel like justice, like closure, like the ending Dorothy had written for in her journal when she'd said she knew I'd win, and I was winning, was about to win so completely that my mother would spend years in federal prison understanding exactly what it cost to underestimate me, to steal from the woman who raised me, to try to take what was rightfully mine. And those years, that time, that consequence, it wouldn't bring Dorothy back, wouldn't undo the suffering, wouldn't erase the shame she'd felt, but it would mean something, would stand for something, would be proof that sometimes, if you're patient enough, careful enough, strong enough, the people who hurt you face consequences, real consequences, permanent consequences, and justice, delayed but real, finally arrives. The trial began on October 15th, federal courthouse in Milwaukee, courtroom packed with people I didn't know, journalists, law students, other fraud examiners who'd heard about the case and wanted to see how it played out. And I sat in the gallery for the opening statements, wasn't testifying until day 3, but wanted to be there, wanted to see my mother's face when the prosecution laid out the case, when they presented the timeline, when they showed the jury exactly what she'd done, exactly how she'd done it, exactly why she was sitting at the defense table facing years in federal prison. And she looked different than she had in the probate hearing, looked smaller somehow, diminished, wearing a modest navy suit that was clearly chosen by her attorney to make her look sympathetic, to make her look like someone's mother, someone's grandmother, someone who couldn't possibly be a criminal. But I knew better, knew that clothes didn't change character, knew that performance didn't erase crimes, knew that she was exactly as guilty as the charges claimed, and sitting there watching her pretend to be something she wasn't, watching her lawyer paint her as confused, as misled by Theodore, as someone who'd made mistakes but not crimes, it made my jaw clench, made my hands curl into fists, made me grateful I wasn't testifying today because I didn't trust myself to stay professional, to stay calm, to present evidence without letting my rage show through. But by day 3, by the time they called me to the stand, I'd be ready, would be controlled, would be the expert witness prosecutors needed rather than the grieving granddaughter seeking revenge, would be both things simultaneously but showing only one, only the professional, only the credible, only the version of myself that judges and juries trusted, believed, convicted based on. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating, was precise, was everything I'd hoped it would be. Rebecca Cho standing in front of the jury explaining elder financial abuse, explaining how it works, how predators identify vulnerable victims, how they gain trust, how they exploit confusion, how they steal systematically, carefully over time, and then she walked through my grandmother's case specifically, the timeline, the withdrawals, the forged power of attorney, the journal entries, and I watched the jury's faces, watched them shift from neutral to concerned to angry, watched them look at my mother with expressions that weren't sympathetic anymore, weren't uncertain, were starting to harden into judgment, into conviction, and that shift, that moment when strangers who'd never met Dorothy, who had no reason to care about her except their own sense of justice, when they decided she mattered, her suffering mattered, her story mattered, that moment made me cry, made tears run down my face that I couldn't stop, couldn't control, and Cameron, who was sitting beside me, handed me tissues and whispered, "You okay?" And I nodded because I was okay, was better than okay, was watching justice happen, was seeing the system work the way it was supposed to work, was understanding that sometimes the good guys win, the criminals face consequences, and truth, documented truth, the kind my grandmother had left me, the kind I'd built into an unbeatable case, that truth was powerful enough to overcome manipulation, to overcome performance, to overcome every lie my mother had told herself and tried to sell to others, and that power, that vindication, it was worth everything, worth the months of stress, worth the damaged reputation, worth the administrative review at work, worth all of it because I was watching the system recognize what had happened, validate it, prepare to punish it, and that recognition, that validation, it meant Dorothy's suffering hadn't been invisible, hadn't been ignored, hadn't been swept under the rug the way she'd feared it would be when she was writing in her journal, too ashamed to tell me, too proud to ask for help, too scared that no one would believe her over her own daughter. Theodore's trial was separate. His lawyer had successfully argued for severance, claimed that being tried together would prejudice the jury, would make them unable to distinguish between the defendant's individual actions, and the judge had agreed. So Theodore's trial would happen after, would be influenced by whatever happened in my mother's trial, would be easier to convict if we convicted her first, which was another reason this trial mattered so much, mattered beyond just my grandmother, beyond just our family, mattered because there were other victims, other families, other people Theodore had hurt who were waiting to see if justice was possible, if the system would protect them, if their losses would be acknowledged, and my testimony, my evidence, my careful documentation, it wasn't just for Dorothy anymore. It was for all of them. For Geraldine Hollister, who died with nothing left after Theodore had drained her accounts, for Theodore's first wife, whose estate had mysteriously evaporated, for everyone else we hadn't found yet, hadn't identified yet, but who Agent Morales believed existed, believed were out there, believed had been victimized by a man who'd spent decades perfecting the art of stealing from people who'd trusted him, who'd loved him, who'd believed that family meant protection rather than predation, and stopping him, convicting him, putting him in prison where he couldn't hurt anyone else. That required convicting my mother first, required this trial to succeed, required the jury to see clearly, to understand fully, to believe completely that what had happened to Dorothy Bergman was criminal, was intentional, was worthy of the maximum sentence, and I was going to make sure they saw that, understood that, believed that, because this wasn't just about revenge anymore, wasn't just about my pain, was about protection, was about prevention, was about making sure that other elderly people, other vulnerable people, other confused, scared, ashamed victims had a chance, had hope, had proof that the system could work if you documented everything, if you built your case carefully, if you refused to let criminals win just because they were family. My testimony began on day 3. Morning session. Rebecca Cho called my name, and I walked to the witness stand feeling eerily calm, feeling centered, feeling like I'd been preparing for this moment for 7 years, for 19 years, for my entire life, and I was sworn in, promised to tell the truth, sat down, adjusted the microphone, looked at the jury, looked at my mother who was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read, couldn't interpret, couldn't tell if it was hatred or fear or regret or just blankness, just absence of any real feeling. And Rebecca started with the basics, asked about my education, my training, my certification as a fraud examiner, my 7 years of experience, my 38 cases, my 11 testimonies in Judge Kowalski's courtroom, building my credibility, establishing my expertise, making absolutely certain the jury understood that I wasn't just a granddaughter seeking revenge. I was a professional who investigated these crimes for a living, who knew what elder financial abuse looked like, who could recognize patterns, who could distinguish between normal family financial support and systematic exploitation, and the jury listened, took notes, looked at me with expressions that suggested they were taking me seriously, were respecting my expertise, were understanding that what I was about to tell them wasn't just opinion, wasn't just emotion, was professional analysis backed by training, by experience, by years of doing exactly this work. And that understanding, that credibility, it was the foundation everything else would be built on, was the reason Rebecca had spent 30 minutes just establishing who I was before even mentioning my grandmother, before even starting to talk about the case, because credibility had to come first, had to be unshakable, had to be so solid that when the defense tried to attack it, tried to suggest I was biased, was emotional, was unreliable, the jury would already know better, would already have decided I was trustworthy, and that decision, that early judgment, it would color everything else, would make my testimony powerful, would make my evidence unbeatable. Rebecca asked me to describe my relationship with my grandmother, to explain how often I saw her, what our relationship was like, and I told the truth. Told them about Sunday mornings, about coffee with 2 sugars and a splash of whole milk, about balancing her checkbook together, about her teaching me to track expenses, to save receipts, to understand that paper trails don't lie, and I watched the jury respond, watched their faces soften, watched them see Dorothy as a person, as a real woman, with habits and preferences and a granddaughter who loved her, not just as a victim, not just as a case number, but as someone who mattered, who'd lived, who'd taught 3rd graders to read for 36 years and saved every penny and deserved to die with dignity rather than in shame, in confusion, in the knowledge that her own daughter had robbed her, and making them see her that way, making them understand who she was, that was crucial, was essential, was what would make them care enough to convict, because juries don't convict for abstract victims, they convict for real people they can imagine, can empathize with, can see themselves or their own grandmothers in, and I was painting that picture, was creating that connection, was making Dorothy real to 12 strangers who would decide whether her suffering mattered enough to send her daughter to prison, and I could see it working, could see them leaning forward, could see them engaged, could see them caring, and that caring, that emotional investment, it was what justice required, what convictions were built on, what separated cases that succeeded from cases that failed. Then Rebecca shifted, asked me about my mother, about our relationship, about the abandonment, and I told that story too, told them about being 14, about the divorce, about the remarriage, about being erased, about 19 years of silence, of absence, of being forgotten except when money was involved, and I saw the jury's expressions change again, saw confusion, saw disapproval, saw them starting to understand that this wasn't just about elder abuse, this was about a pattern, was about someone who saw family as resources, saw people as tools, saw relationships as transactional, who'd thrown away her daughter when that daughter stopped being useful, and then tried to steal from her mother when her mother became vulnerable. And that pattern, that consistency, it was damning, was proof that this wasn't mistakes, wasn't confusion, wasn't anything except calculated predation, and the jury was seeing it, was understanding it, was beginning to believe that the woman at the defense table wasn't a confused daughter who'd made errors in judgment. She was a criminal who'd been operating this way for decades, who'd hurt everyone close to her, who deserved exactly what the prosecution was asking for, which was the maximum sentence, 5 years, real time, federal time, in a facility where she'd have years to think about what she'd done, who she'd hurt, what she'd lost through her own choices, her own greed, her own inability to see people as anything except sources of money, of advantage, of things she could take, And those years, that time, that consequence, it was coming. I could feel it, could see it in the jury's faces, could hear it in the questions Rebecca was asking, questions designed to highlight the cruelty, the calculation, the absolute heartlessness of what my mother had done. And I answered each one carefully, precisely, professionally, giving them facts, giving them evidence, giving them everything they needed to convict, to punish, to deliver justice that had been 19 years delayed, but was finally arriving. Rebecca presented the bank records through me, asked me to explain what I was seeing, what the patterns meant, how these withdrawals compared to Dorothy's normal spending, and I walked through it methodically, showed them the baseline, showed them the disruption, showed them the acceleration, explained that this trajectory, this pattern of increasing frequency and increasing amounts, this was textbook elder financial abuse, was exactly what we saw in cases where someone was systematically draining an account, exploiting confusion, taking advantage of someone who trusted them, who loved them, who wanted to believe they were helping rather than hurting, and I explained that the timing was significant, that each withdrawal happening within days of a visit from my mother, that wasn't coincidence, wasn't random, was evidence of coordination, of planning, of someone who knew when Dorothy would be most confused, most vulnerable, most likely to agree to withdraw money, to sign papers, to trust that her daughter had her best interests at heart. And the jury took notes, asked questions through the judge, wanted to understand the details, wanted to see the evidence clearly, and Rebecca provided copies, provided blown-up versions of the bank statements with the dates highlighted, with the amount circled, with the pattern made so obvious that even someone with no financial training could see it, could understand it, could recognize it for what it was, which was theft, systematic theft. The kind that happened slowly enough that the victim didn't realize until it was too late, until the money was gone, until the shame was too deep to overcome, until death was approaching and there was no time left to fix it, to recover, to report, only time left to document it, to leave evidence, to hope that someone who loved you would find it and fight back in ways you couldn't fight yourself. And Dorothy had done that, had left me that evidence, and I was using it exactly as she'd intended, exactly as she'd hoped. And wherever she was, whatever came after death, I hoped she could see this, could see her daughter being held accountable, could see justice happening, could see that her suffering hadn't been meaningless, that her shame hadn't been permanent, that her story was being told, was being heard, was mattering to people who'd never met her but were deciding right now that she deserved justice, deserved vindication, deserved to have her death mean something. The defense attorney, a man named Martin Gershwin, who was maybe 55, tried to cross-examine me, tried to suggest I was biased, was emotional, was letting my feelings about being abandoned color my interpretation of the evidence, and I stayed calm, stayed professional, stated that yes, I had personal feelings about my mother, about our relationship, about being abandoned, but that those feelings didn't change the bank records, didn't change the forged power of attorney, didn't change Dorothy's journal, didn't change any of the evidence. The evidence was objective, was verifiable, was exactly what it appeared to be, which was documentation of systematic theft, and my personal history with my mother, my complicated feelings, none of that changed the facts, changed the patterns, changed the reality of what had happened. And Martin tried again, tried to suggest that my grandmother had been confused, had written things in her journal that weren't accurate, that I was taking confused writings and presenting them as truth, and I looked at him, looked at the jury, and said my grandmother tracked every penny she spent for 43 years. Her financial records are impeccable, her documentation is thorough, her mental acuity on her good days was sharp, clear, completely lucid. She knew what she was writing, knew what was happening, knew she was being stolen from, and documented it, because that's who she was, that's what she'd taught me, that's how she'd lived her entire life. And suggesting that suddenly, conveniently, in the specific entries that document theft, suggesting that suddenly she was too confused to be reliable, that's insulting, that's offensive, that's exactly the kind of dismissal that allows elder abuse to continue, allows predators to get away with it, allows families to sweep it under the rug and say, oh, grandma was just confused, when the truth is grandma was absolutely clear about what was happening, was just too ashamed to say it out loud, was just too afraid no one would believe her. And I'm here to say I believe her. The evidence supports her. Every single thing she wrote is corroborated by financial records, by timelines, by patterns that are consistent with known exploitation methodologies, and 12 jurors need to believe her too, need to understand that her voice, speaking through that journal, is credible, is true, is deserving of justice. Martin Gershwin sat down after that, didn't ask any more questions, looked like he'd realized that attacking my credibility was making things worse, was making the jury angry, was making them more sympathetic to me, more determined to convict, and Rebecca stood for redirect, asked just one question, Ms. Bergman, in your professional opinion, based on your 7 years of investigating elder financial abuse, based on the 38 cases you've worked, based on your training and experience, was your grandmother Dorothy Bergman a victim of financial exploitation? And I looked at the jury, looked at each face, made eye contact, made sure they heard this, made sure they understood this, and I said yes, absolutely, unequivocally, my grandmother was victimized, was exploited, was systematically robbed by someone she trusted, someone she loved, someone who knew she was vulnerable and chose to hurt her anyway. This is one of the clearest cases I've ever seen. The documentation is thorough. The pattern is obvious. The evidence is overwhelming, and in my professional opinion, the person who victimized her, who stole from her, who forged documents to access her accounts, that person is the defendant, is Daisy Hollister, is my mother, and she needs to be held accountable, needs to face consequences, needs to understand that what she did was criminal, was wrong, was deserving of punishment, and I hope this jury will deliver that punishment, will provide that accountability, will give my grandmother the justice she deserved but didn't live to see, and I hope they do it decisively, completely, with the maximum sentence, because that's what this case requires, that's what justice demands, that's what will protect other vulnerable people from experiencing what my grandmother experienced, and that protection, that precedent, that's worth fighting for, that's worth testifying for, that's worth everything I've put into building this case, and I finished, was done testifying, was dismissed from the stand, and I walked back to my seat feeling lighter, feeling like I'd said everything I needed to say, like I'd done everything I could do, like the rest was up to the jury, up to 12 strangers who now held my mother's fate in their hands, who would decide whether 5 years in prison was appropriate, was what this case required. And sitting there watching the trial continue, watching other witnesses testify, watching the prosecution build layer upon layer of evidence, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. I felt hope, real hope, that justice was possible, that the system worked, that patience and documentation and refusing to give up had been worth it, and whatever the jury decided, however this ended, I'd done everything Dorothy had asked me to do, had fought the way she'd known I'd fight, had won in ways that mattered, and that winning, that success, it was enough, was more than enough, was everything. The jury deliberated for 4 hours, which Rebecca told me was actually a good sign, meant they were taking it seriously, were going through the evidence carefully, were making sure they got it right, and I spent those 4 hours in a conference room down the hall with Cameron, with Caroline who'd come to see the verdict, with Agent Morales who'd invested months in this investigation, and we didn't talk much, didn't speculate, just waited, just existed in that strange suspended state where everything has been done, all the evidence has been presented, all the arguments have been made, and now strangers are deciding what happens next, deciding whether my mother goes to prison, deciding whether Dorothy's suffering matters enough to convict, and that waiting, that powerlessness, it was harder than testifying, harder than building the case, harder than everything except maybe standing at Dorothy's grave, knowing what had been done to her, and not yet knowing if justice was possible. And when my phone buzzed, when the text came from Rebecca saying verdict is in, be in the courtroom in 10 minutes, my hands started shaking, my heart started racing, and Cameron took my hand, squeezed it twice the way Daniel used to, the way I'd learned meant I love you without words, and we walked back to the courtroom, filed in with everyone else, took our seats, and I looked at my mother, looked at her sitting at the defense table with her lawyers, and she looked smaller than I remembered, looked older, looked like someone who'd finally run out of performance, out of energy, out of the ability to pretend she was anything except what she was, which was a woman who'd made terrible choices and was about to learn what those choices cost. The jury filed in, 12 faces that gave nothing away, that had been trained not to look at the defendants, not to signal their decision, just to sit and wait while the judge asked if they'd reached a verdict, and the foreperson, a middle-aged woman in a cardigan, stood and said, "Yes, Your Honor, we have," and she handed the form to the bailiff who handed it to the judge, and Judge Martinez, a different judge than Kowalski but equally experienced, equally serious, read the verdict silently, his face showing nothing, and then he handed it back to the bailiff who handed it to the foreperson, and she read, her voice clear and steady, "We the jury find the defendant Daisy Hollister guilty on count 1, theft from a vulnerable adult, guilty on count 2, wire fraud, Guilty on count 3, mail fraud. Guilty on count 4, forgery of legal documents. Guilty on all counts, all 6 counts, every single charge. And the courtroom erupted, not loudly, not dramatically, but with that collective intake of breath, that sound of 12 people gasping simultaneously, of journalists typing furiously, of me crying without meaning to, without wanting to, just tears streaming down my face because guilty, she was guilty. The jury had believed me, had believed Dorothy, had believed the evidence, had decided that what happened mattered, that consequences were required, that my mother was exactly what the prosecution had said she was, which was a criminal, and criminals went to prison, and she was going to prison 5 years minimum, possibly more depending on sentencing, and that number, that time, it felt like vindication, felt like justice, felt like Dorothy's voice speaking through 12 strangers saying, yes, what happened to you is wrong, yes, your suffering mattered, yes, we believe you, we see you, we will punish the person who hurt you. My mother didn't react at first, just sat there staring straight ahead like she hadn't heard, like the words hadn't reached her, like she was still waiting for the real verdict, the one where the jury said innocent, where they said it was all a misunderstanding, where they said she could go home, but that verdict wasn't coming, would never come, because the jury had seen through her, had seen through the performance, had understood what I'd spent 7 years learning how to show people, which was that financial abuse follows patterns, leaves evidence, can be proven if you document carefully, and I documented everything, had presented everything, had given them no room for doubt, no space for reasonable questions, just clear, incontrovertible evidence that Dorothy had been exploited, had been robbed, had been victimized by her own daughter, and the jury had responded exactly as they should have, exactly as justice required, and watching my mother finally understand that this was real, that she'd been convicted, that she was going to prison, watching her face crumble, watching her turn to Martin Gershwin looking for answers, for explanations, for some way out that didn't exist, I felt something complicated, felt satisfaction, yes, but also something like sorrow, like mourning, like I was watching the final death of any possibility that she could have been different, could have chosen differently, could have been the mother I'd needed instead of the criminal she'd become. And that possibility, that hope, it was dying right there in front of me, and even though it had always been fantasy, had always been wishful thinking, letting it go still hurt, still felt like loss, still required me to grieve something that had never existed except in my imagination, in my desperate childhood need to believe that mothers loved their daughters, that family meant safety, that blood created obligation, protection, care, except it didn't, except my mother had proven over and over. That biology created nothing, guaranteed nothing, meant nothing compared to character, to choices, to the kind of person you decided to be when nobody was watching, when consequences seemed impossible, when vulnerable people trusted you. Sentencing was set for 6 weeks later, December 3rd, and in those 6 weeks Theodore went to trial, his case even more damning than my mother's because the prosecution could now show pattern, could show that he'd done this before, had done it to his own mother, had possibly done it to his first wife, had taught my mother how to do it to Dorothy, had built a career out of exploiting elderly women. And the jury in his case took only 2 hours to convict, found him guilty on 9 counts, federal counts, serious counts, counts that carried longer sentences because of the pattern, because of the number of victims, because Theodore Hollister wasn't just someone who'd made mistakes, he was a professional predator, and predators got longer sentences, got harder time, got sent to facilities far from home where visits were difficult, where contact was limited, where years stretched out long and hard and uncomfortable, and that's exactly what he deserved, exactly what the system was designed to deliver. Exactly what justice required when someone spent decades hurting vulnerable people, when someone made a living out of trust and then betrayed that trust systematically, repeatedly, without remorse, without conscience, without any recognition that what he was doing was destroying lives, destroying families, destroying the last years of people who'd worked hard, saved carefully, deserved better than to die in poverty, because their own children, their own family, had stolen everything they'd built. December 3rd arrived cold and gray, Milwaukee winter settling in, snow threatening but not quite falling, and I drove to the courthouse alone because Cameron was teaching, because Caroline had other cases, because this was something I needed to do by myself, needed to see by myself, needed to process by myself. The final chapter, the ending to a story that had started 19 years ago when my mother had decided I wasn't worth keeping, and now Now I was going to watch a judge decide how many years she wasn't worth keeping out of prison, how long she needed to be separated from society, from freedom, from the ability to hurt other people. And I sat in the courtroom and listened to the victim impact statements, listened to other people Theodore had hurt, other families who'd lost money, lost security, lost faith in humanity because someone they'd trusted had destroyed them. And I listened to the assistant U.S. attorney argue for maximum sentences, argue that people who prey on the elderly, who exploit confusion, who steal from their own families, those people needed serious consequences, needed real punishment, needed to understand that this society, this system, would not tolerate predation, would not accept exploitation, would not allow criminals to operate unchecked. And then Judge Martinez asked if I wanted to make a statement, asked if I wanted to address the court before sentencing, and I stood, walked to the podium, looked at my mother sitting at the defense table. And I spoke, not to her exactly, but about her, about what she'd done, about who she'd hurt, about why this mattered. I said, Your Honor, my grandmother Dorothy Bergman was the strongest person I ever knew. She raised me when my mother decided she had better things to do. She taught me how to track expenses, how to save money, how to understand that paper trails don't lie. She taught me everything I know about financial responsibility, about integrity, about showing up for people you love. And in her final year, when she was vulnerable, when she was confused, when she needed protection the most, her own daughter, my mother, exploited her, stole from her, made her final months on earth filled with shame, with secrecy, with the knowledge that her own child was robbing her and she was too embarrassed to tell anyone. That shame, that betrayal, it killed something in her, and I'll never get that back. Never get to tell her that it wasn't her fault, that she wasn't weak. That being victimized by someone you love doesn't make you stupid or broken or anything except human. And my mother, the woman, sitting at that table, she needs to understand what she did. Needs to understand that stealing from elderly people isn't a mistake, it's a crime. Needs to understand that exploiting your own mother's confusion isn't family support, it's predation, and predators need to be stopped, need to be punished, need to spend time in prison understanding that what they did matters, that victims matter, that justice is real. And I'm asking this court to impose the maximum sentence, to send a message that elder abuse has consequences, that families who hurt vulnerable people will be held accountable, that my grandmother's suffering, her shame, her death, will mean something, will protect other people, will stand as proof that even when victims are too ashamed to speak up, even when they're too dead to testify, their stories can still be told, their voices can still be heard, their justice can still be delivered. And I finished, sat down, felt Cameron's hand on my shoulder, even though he wasn't there, felt Dorothy's presence somehow, felt like I'd said everything I needed to say, like I'd honor her memory, like I'd fought the way she'd known I would fight, and now it was up to the judge, up to the system, up to justice to do its job. Judge Martinez sentenced my mother to 5 years in federal prison. The maximum for her charges, said that people who exploit vulnerable adults, who betray family trust, who forge documents to steal from their own mothers, those people need serious consequences, said that the court had considered her age, her lack of prior criminal record, but that the deliberate nature of her crimes, the vulnerability of her victim, the betrayal of trust, all of that weighed heavily in favor of maximum sentence, said that 5 years was appropriate, was just, was necessary to protect the public, to deter others, to deliver justice for Dorothy Bergman, who couldn't be here to see it but whose story had been powerful enough, whose documentation had been thorough enough, whose granddaughter had been brave enough, to ensure that her death meant something, that her suffering wasn't invisible, that her voice was heard even from beyond the grave. And Theodore got 8.5 years, got longer. Because of the pattern, because of multiple victims, because he'd done this before and would do it again if given the chance. And I watched them both, watched my mother cry, watched Theodore stay blank, watched the bailiffs prepare to take them into custody immediately. No more pretrial release, no more going home, just straight to processing, to federal detention, to the beginning of years they'd spend in prison understanding what they'd done, what they'd lost, what they'd destroyed through their own choices. And I felt nothing, felt empty, felt like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that putting it down left me lighter but also unbalanced, unsure what to do with hands that weren't holding weight anymore, unsure how to exist without the case, without the fight, without the mission that had consumed me for months. I drove home in silence, parked in my driveway, sat in the car for a long time before going inside, and when I finally walked in, Cameron was there, had gotten a substitute for his afternoon classes, had come home early because he'd known I'd meet him, and he didn't ask how it went, didn't ask what I was feeling, just held me while I cried, while I finally let myself fall apart, while I finally released months of tension, of stress, of holding myself together through testimony and trials, and the constant performance of being professional, being credible, being strong. And I cried for Dorothy, cried for the girl I'd been when my mother left, cried for the woman I'd become building a life without family, cried for everything I'd lost and everything I'd gained and everything that would never be healed, never be fixed, never be anything except permanent damage that I'd learned to carry, to live with, to build around rather than through. And Cameron just held me, didn't try to fix it, didn't try to minimize it, didn't tell me it would be okay, just gave me space to break, to grieve, to finally let go of the hope I'd been carrying that somehow this would end differently, that somehow my mother would be different. And that letting go, that acceptance, it hurt worse than anything except standing at Dorothy's grave knowing what had been done to her. Except now I could stand at that grave knowing justice had been delivered, knowing her story had been told, knowing her suffering had mattered, and that knowing, that certainty, it was worth everything, worth every hard moment, worth every painful choice, worth the permanent separation from family that was supposed to love me but never had, never would, never could because they'd chosen greed over love, chosen theft over integrity, chosen themselves over everyone else every single time, and those choices, those patterns, they had consequences, real consequences, permanent consequences, and watching those consequences arrive, watching justice delivered, watching my mother taken into custody to begin 5 years in federal prison, that was closure, that was ending, that was the final chapter in a story that had started with abandonment and ended with accountability. 6 months after the sentencing, I stood at Dorothy's grave, placed flowers, pearl earrings in my ears, her pearl earrings, the ones she'd worn for 40 years, the ones my mother had stolen and worn to court, the ones that were mine now, legally mine, rightfully mine, and I told her everything, told her about the trial, about the conviction, about the sentencing, about the 5 years, about Theodore's 8.5 years, about the FBI investigation that was still finding victims, still uncovering crimes, still building cases against people who thought they could hurt vulnerable elderly people without consequences. And I told her I was sorry I hadn't seen it sooner, sorry I hadn't stopped it while she was alive, sorry she'd felt too ashamed to tell me, but I also told her thank you. Thank you for documenting everything. Thank you for leaving me the weapons I needed. Thank you for believing I'd fight. Thank you for raising me to understand that paper trails don't lie. That documentation defeats manipulation, that patience and precision beat performance and lies every single time. And I told her I missed her, would always miss her, would carry her forward in everything I did, every case I worked, every victim I helped, every predator I caught. And that carrying, that legacy, it meant her death wasn't meaningless, wasn't the end, was actually the beginning of something bigger, something that protected other people, other families, other vulnerable elderly. People who deserved to age with dignity, who deserved to trust their families, who deserved better than what Dorothy had gotten, but whose suffering would be prevented because Dorothy had spoken up through that journal, through those bank records, through the evidence she'd left that had convicted her daughter, that had sent Theodore to prison, that had stopped 2 predators who would have kept hurting people if she hadn't been brave enough, careful enough, thorough enough to document everything. I'm Nancy Bergman, and I'm 33 years old, and my mother is in federal prison serving 5 years for stealing from my grandmother, for exploiting her, for betraying every trust, every bond, every relationship that should have been sacred but was just transactional to her, just opportunities to take, to exploit, to use. And I want you to know that if you're watching this, if you've stayed through this whole story, if you've seen how it ends, I want you to understand that justice is possible, that documentation wins, that paper trails really don't lie, that patient, careful preparation beats manipulation every single time. And if you're dealing with family who hurt you, family who steal from you, family who exploit vulnerability and call it love, you can fight back, you can win, you can hold them accountable, and you should, because letting predators operate unchecked means they hurt more people, means other victims suffer, means the cycle continues, and breaking that cycle, stopping those predators, delivering justice for victims who can't deliver it themselves, that's worth everything, worth the pain, Worth the cost, worth the permanent family separation, because some families are toxic, some families are criminal, and walking away from them, prosecuting them, watching them face consequences, that's not betrayal. That's survival. That's protection. That's justice. And if this story helped you see that, if you needed proof that fighting back is worth it, if you needed to know that sometimes the system works, that sometimes careful documentation and professional testimony and refusing to give up leads to conviction, to sentencing, to real consequences for real crimes, then I'm glad you stayed, glad you listened, glad you saw how this ended, because endings matter, consequences matter, justice matters, and my grandmother Dorothy Bergman, who saved every penny, who tracked every dollar, who taught me everything about integrity and documentation, and fighting for what's right, she got justice, she got vindication, she got a courtroom full of people who believed her, who valued her, who decided her suffering mattered enough to convict, and that mattering, that recognition, that's what I fought for. That's what I won. And if you want to see more stories about people who fought back, who documented everything, who refused to let predators win, there's another story waiting right there on your screen. Another case of family betrayal, another journey from victim to victor. Another proof that justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Sometimes it's justice that arrives exactly when it's supposed to, exactly when you're ready for it, exactly when the evidence is strong enough, the case is solid enough, the truth is clear enough that no lies can survive it, no performance can hide it, no manipulation can defeat it, and that truth, that victory, that justice, it's real, it's possible, it's worth every hard moment, every painful choice, every sacrifice required to deliver it. So watch that next story, see how it plays out, understand that you're not alone, that other people have fought these fights, have won these wars, have survived these families, and came out stronger, wiser, freer, and that freedom, that hard-earned, survival-tested, genuine freedom, it's everything, it's worth everything, and it's waiting for you too if you're brave enough, careful enough, patient enough to document everything, to build your case, to fight back against people who think family means they can hurt you without consequences, because consequences are coming, justice is possible, and paper trails, careful, thorough, documented paper trails, they really, really don't lie.